So today I'm going to talk a little bit about an emerging conflict that we've had over the last decade that we want to be sure that we plan for ahead of time, because we're moving toward a solar-powered civilization, whether people like that or not. So we got to figure out how to get solar panels onto landscapes without destroying, damaging landscapes. And that's kind of the crux of this green civil war, biodiversity versus climate change. Both of them urgent crises facing our planet. And one of the things in California, the largest land use change is from solar in recent years. I'm going to grab a pointer here.
Interesting. If you want at any point to lay off somebody who's been doing development in the industry for the last 10 years,
Okay.
feel free to. Otherwise, I'll zip it.
Yeah, that sounds good. No, so apologies for that. So California continues to set records. Obviously, more and more solar is being added to the grid. A lot of this is coming from utility scale. There's a lot of it on the other side of the meter, going on rooftops and such. And this is from March 2017, where California got almost 50% of its electricity from solar power in the middle of the day, and that's happened a couple times since. So we're starting to see increasing amounts of solar delivered to California. This is giving you a rough picture of where a lot of the generation for California is coming from. Some of it's coming from Arizona and Nevada, where the governance is actually a little bit different than in California. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. There's not a lot of stuff going on in Northern California, so that means partly because of the solar insulation, partly because of the availability of public lands in the Mojave Desert and the Colorado Desert, and we've seen quite a large amount of solar being sited in desert landscapes. Obviously, it's sunnier there, you're going to get more generation. But with this transformation and this growth of solar in the Mojave Desert and Colorado deserts, comes this land use change pattern that we're starting to see. And solar power plants, utility scale projects, have a pretty significant land use change effect. It's very similar to agriculture. You get a lot of scraping. They basically try to make the land as homogeneous as possible for worker safety reasons. There's burrows, there's cactuses, there's all sorts of stuff that people can bump into, so they're trying to make these landscapes pretty largely barren. There's fire issues, grass, all sorts of stuff. So you're seeing here, this is actually Joshua Tree National Park up in the far corner here. This is the beginning of what is the largest solar power plant in California. There's two of them the same size, near Desert Center, California. The point of showing this picture is how intensively the landscape is actually shaped when they start to transform these. There's a lot of work that we have to do to tell people what is out in the Mojave Desert. I mean, at San Jose State, I deal with a lot of students who are coming from backgrounds where they've actually never even really left the Bay Area. So they also think, in some ways, deserts are wastelands. This is something we've inherited from our ancestors, that deserts are inhospitable places. They're places that are dangerous at times. But in California, you go out there at certain times of the year, you see this is actually exploding with life. Right, very rich. Go to Joshua Tree National Park. A lot of these species have been implicated in many of the desert controversies in California. So where I like to situate a lot of my work is in this area in science and technology studies. That's partly where I park a lot of my research, which is looking at how do we plan for scaling up this industry. We've already seen a lot of solar go in California, but we've got a lot more to go. Right? And we got Arizona, we got Nevada. Think about the West. We have a lot of landscapes that are going to face pressures. So, and I study the whole commodity chain. So I've been looking at manufacturing, recycling issues. The same questions basically are there. What do we need to plan for to make sure that this energy source doesn't cause the same kinds of damage that the other ones? And I'll say straight off the bat, solar is better than all these other sources that we've been using over the years, natural gas, coal. But there are major challenges with it. And that's partly because we were moving from using subterranean resources, which are mainly under the ground, to having to collect them on the surface of the earth. And that's inevitably going to lead to land use conflicts. There's something in the social sciences that studies this topic called the social gap in renewable energy, and that's the gap is the distance between those who, if polled, say they support renewables. It turns out to be very bipartisan. Both Republicans and Democrats generally like renewables. You look at California, most of the solar in California is in Republican congressional districts. Most of the wind in the United States, Republican congressional districts. So these are largely bipartisan. When you try to cite a project, however, very difficult. Suddenly you get a lot of people who are not happy about the project, how it fits into landscape context, all sorts of things. So these are questions that social scientists are asking related to the social planning for energy transition. How do we actually get more support for renewables, or what's actually causing the social resistance to that? And that's what I'll talk a little bit about today. When people have asked in the past, what are the causes of social resistance to solar power plants, or any infrastructure projects in general, NIMBY is a term you often hear, not in my backyard. The social science on this topic actually find that to not be a very helpful explanation. The self-interested explanations are not necessarily as helpful. If you actually start to look at this in more detail, public participation, the role of participation, turns out to be very, very important. There tends to be an inherited process where decisions are made, then they're announced, and then they defend. It's called decide, announce, defend. And what those social scientists who study this topic say, public participation, getting people stakeholder buy-in early on is very, very critical to making these projects not face lawsuits, litigation, regulatory hurdles, and all that stuff. And you actually learn a lot through that public participation process too, about the landscapes and things. So very important. Other things happen too, like obviously people aren't going to resist solar power plants if they have part ownership in it, right? So like having a sense of ownership or even direct ownership also tends to be a good explanation for that. But the point of this is to say it's not just NIMBYism. A lot of it has to do with the process that people are resistant to. But NIMBYism, there's partly it's in there, but it's not an overwhelming explanation. This is the Ivanpah Solar Electric Generating Station. This is as it's being built over here, so there's no heliostats in this yet, just some roads. So this is a quote from Arnold Schwarzenegger about 10 years ago. They say we want renewable energy, but we don't want you to put it anywhere. I mean, if we can't put solar power plants in the Mojave Desert, I don't know where the hell we could put it. I can think of some places you could probably put it, but... So these are the questions I'll try to address over the next 20 minutes or so. What explains this social gap in utility scale siting, particularly in the American Southwest? And to give away the punchline there, a lot of it has to do with the role of public lands and the fact that lands that have been in public maintenance and conservation for over 100 years now have become suddenly open and available for solar development. And that's changed a little bit, and I'll talk about that. And then what can we learn from these experiences in California and the American Southwest to inform better social planning for energy transitions? What mistakes were made? What can we learn from them and go forward in a positive way? So just really briefly, how did we get to where we are today? There are really three major drivers that have led to the amount of solar that we have in California today. One of them is the creation of new markets. So the utilities were required to purchase renewable energy. That's called the Renewable Energy Portfolio Standard. So that made the business case essentially for a lot of these developers to say, hey, we can sell electricity to utilities. There's a market for that. Then there were a bunch of loan and grant programs that basically came out of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the stimulus bill. You might remember that from about a decade ago. And that had to do with loan programs and grant programs. And in some ways, it was a socializing of the risk, sharing of that risk between private and public that led to a lot of these early projects being built. Third, and this is probably the key Green Civil War issue here, the Bureau of Land Management, who is under the Department of Interior, manages about 250 million acres across the U.S. They were given a mandate under the Energy Policy Act of 2005 to develop 10 gigawatts worth of renewables on public lands. And that was expanded to 20 gigawatts a few years later. And this became pretty challenging because now it basically meant that you had to develop lands that have been in default conservation for the last 100 years for solar development. And there's some fast tracking stuff as well. In order to access some of these stimulus funds, they had to be shovel-ready projects, meaning that they were expedited environmental reviews, and that was problematic. The story really starts off in California in this area called the Sleeping Beauty Wilderness. Anybody ever heard of this area? It's probably because there's no roads to it. The only road to this is actually a utility maintenance road that goes out there. And this project, this area there's about 15 solar projects cited in this. So in 2005, after that the BLM was given this mandate to develop public lands, suddenly you saw speculators from all over Goldman Sachs, everybody was buying up land or parking themselves on parcels. And one of them was Bright Source Energy, and they had proposed a couple of projects in the Sleeping Beauty Wilderness for solar power towers, which are using mirrors to create heat to turn a turbine. And those are very problematic because these are areas in the desert, the California Desert Conservation Area, so they have a much stricter set of regulatory rules they have to develop these projects, but they're also very intact wilderness areas. This is actually adjacent to the Mojave National Preserve. It's a little bit west of that. So you had a developer, Bright Source, who was backed by a whole bunch of different companies. One of the people that we heard a lot from Bright Source was one of its partners from Vantage Point Capital, I think he was at, and that's Robert Kennedy. And I want to point out these two New York Times op-eds that Robert Kennedy wrote. This one's in 2005. An Ill Wind Off Cape Cod, it's called. And I'll just read what I have here written in red here. Some places should be off limits to any sort of industrial development. And here he's talking about a wind farm within view of the Kennedy compound that they don't want anymore. Maybe you guys are going to guess what's happening next. 2009, environmentalists clashing with Robert Kennedy over a project that's cited by one of Robert Kennedy's companies. And he, in this op-ed, writes, "I respect that the belief that it's all local, but they're putting the democratic process and sound scientific judgment on hold to jeopardize the energy future of our country." So in some ways, this is showing you a juxtaposition of two different positions, but it's actually coming from the same person. Right? One of them is we need to protect land, we need to be careful about development. The other one's like, the rules and the regulations are getting in the way. What happened in that story was the Sleeping Beauty Wilderness, part of that is it's a legacy of the Catellis land. The Catellis Corporation was basically the real estate arm of the Santa Fe Railroad. And basically, the railroads, through the Homestead Act, were given kind of a checkerboard pattern. This is the Mojave Preserve. This is Joshua Tree National Park here. These red checkered squares here, every other one was owned by BLM or the Catellis Corporation. That's just how they did the railroads. What happened was there's a company called, or an organization called Wildlands Conservancy. They went and bought all those red squares. And then they donated it to the BLM. Now the BLM has a nice big, all-together landscape that's no longer a patchwork to manage. And what does the BLM do? They turn around and open up the solar development. So the first real flashpoint in this Green Civil War comes because lands that were donated, because they raised a lot of money, spent 10 years raising money, millions and millions of dollars to buy all this land, give it to the BLM. Do I have it on here? Yeah. This is the letter from Bill Clinton thanking the organization for donating these lands. They're going to manage them in perpetuity for conservation purposes. And then suddenly you have somewhere on the order of 50,000 acres worth of solar projects being proposed in amongst this wilderness. So this is Robert Kennedy's. So in response to that, Senator Feinstein proposed 2 national monuments which would block Robert Kennedy's company from accessing this. And those eventually became those national monuments that Obama signed at the end of his presidency. The Sea to Sand, I think, and the Mojave Trails. National monuments that are down in the Mojave Desert. This is arguably the best solar land in the world, and Senator Feinstein shouldn't be allowed to take this land off the table without a proper and scientific environmental review. Okay, so you're hearing this. Now, we know that solar power plants do have certain impacts that are, and some of these are considerable. We had a project, we have actually a couple projects, where hundreds of desert tortoise had to be translocated. Now, if you know anything about the desert tortoise, it's a species that's lost 90% of its population in the last 100 years or so. It's largely, the federal government is largely the steward of the species because most of its species occur on federal lands. So they have a somewhat unique responsibility for managing the species. And they don't do well with translocation. You move them, they get disease from being touched. They live somewhere for 50 years. If you pick up, move them somewhere else, they're not necessarily going to translate very well. You're seeing here, this is the first evidence of canine distemper in the kit fox when they were clearing a solar power plant in the Colorado desert. They used coyote urine to get the kit foxes to go out, because if you're going to develop a project, you can't have endangered species on, you got to get them off. So they put coyote urine on the kit fox dens to get the kit fox away, and they transferred distemper to the kit fox population for the first time. So these are major issues. What you're seeing here, that's a singe from a power tower. So those mirrors with the heat. We got one project that's causing about 3,000 birds to die a year. So, and that's partly, it's a very difficult problem to manage, because what they do is, instead of keeping that heat on that receiver, when they go into standby mode, they put that heat up in the air. And then birds just go through. The Fish and Wildlife now has a new term called streamers. And these are birds that fly through the heat halo, and they either pop, disintegrate, or disappear into like a plume of smoke. So, these are things that we have.
Can you define why they put them into standby mode real quick?
I don't know exactly why. It's usually a congestion issue, but sometimes it's to do maintenance. But if you look at the public comments on those projects, a lot of people ask that those mirrors be able to flip the other way for standby mode, but that would, you'd have to, it's very difficult because these are big square mirrors, you can't really fold them over, but that was one of the proposals. And Fish and Wildlife now says that they will never approve another power tower in California, partly. Now Nevada is another story, and Nevada can still sell electricity to California. So there's some projects that are actually being proposed in Nevada. This is a letter from the division chief, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, who put a note basically saying we need a moratorium on solar power towers in California until we can actually resolve this wildlife mortality issue. He was, by the way, when he posted this, he wasn't supposed to post this. He got relocated up to Oregon. Be careful. So another issue. So those are direct wildlife mortality impacts from solar. There's some other ones we might talk about as well. There are also issues because a lot of these projects are very large. So that first project I showed you where they were scraping the land and bulldozing, that project's about 3 miles by 3 miles on the side, or 3 or 4 miles by 4 miles. So it basically take you all day to walk around it. Maybe if you're faster, you can get around. It's hot out there, so take your time. So what you're seeing, look at the size of this thing. We have species out in the Mojave Desert that live in the mountains, like bighorn sheep. And when they get isolated in the mountains, they get inbreeding depression that causes some genetic issues and such. You need a little bit of movement of these species to keep the populations healthy. When you start throwing up big obstacles like this, it makes it a little more difficult. So that's another major concern. Road construction, when you look at wind farms and solar power plants, this turns out to be actually one of the major impacts as well, running over wildlife and the land use change associated with roads. Cryptobiotic soil crust, if you've ever been to Joshua Tree National Park, they have nice little displays on how long it takes to build all this stuff in the soil. Lots of carbon in there, also nutrients for other species and such. Very easily disturbed with when you build solar power plants. This is an interesting issue. There's a plant biologist who runs the UC research station out in the Mojave Desert, and this is a slide from one of his talks. This is Southern California, and each light pixel here represents an herbaria entry into an herbarium. Basically, it's a record of the plant being around. And what you're seeing here is that botanists love to study the California coast. We don't have a lot of records in the Mojave Desert. So his point here is there's a lot of species we haven't even described yet. And we're bulldozing projects without actually looking, or landscapes without actually looking at what's on these landscapes in some cases. So Jim, his name's Jim Andre, he's discovered I think maybe 10 or 12 species in his time in the Mojave Desert. So they're still finding new stuff out there. So this is an important thing to keep in mind here. You may have heard of Thomas Lovejoy or Edward O. Wilson. These are two famous biologists who've been writing on environmental topics for a long time. There was a project called the Soda Mountain Solar Project that had some issues with bighorn sheep migration. It was in a corridor that was potentially important. So they wrote an op-ed to the New York Times on this topic. We're all for solar projects. We need more of them, but not in this place. Right, thinking about that particular impact. Other things that people are concerned about: loss of rural character landscapes, right? Especially in the Mojave Desert, we have these wide, sweeping vistas. You can see that having a solar project in this landscape, this is the Silurian Valley. There's a project that was proposed here, would be a visual disruption and not only an ecosystem disruption. This is out near Panoche Valley in San Benito County, if you've been out there. Ag land is for ranching. For farming and ranching, not industrial development. Right? I think that's part of this too, is that often when you're building these very large projects, it's basically an industrial facility that you're putting out there. And people don't like that in rural areas often. I'm going to read this to you. This is, I think, a really important quote here. This is from a Natural Resource Agency official describing the Ivanpah solar power towers. This is them being built. They're halfway being built here. Those are the mirrors. That's the power tower there. The argument that we must sacrifice fragile ecosystems for the common good is specious, relies on a false choice, and reflects a myopic view of the common good. Do we seriously believe a single coal-fired nuclear power plant will not be built or shut down if this solar project is constructed? Of course, we must do our part to address climate change, but not at the expense of an irreplaceable community jewel. And this is Ivanpah Valley, which was nominated by some organizations as an area of environmental critical concern, which is a special management status that BLM puts on certain lands. They did not get that nomination, partly because of all these solar projects that were being put here. In fact, this project, they moved the tortoises over there, and then another project got proposed, and they moved the tortoises again. Same tortoises. So there's issues with the way the mitigations are being done. There are some things that we don't know a lot about, and that has to do with light pollution. Some folks think that there's a lake effect. So I mentioned the bird mortality from the solar power towers. We're having a lot of birds crash into solar farms in certain areas. There's one project where somewhere on the order of 1,500 birds are crashing, and these are aquatic birds in the Mojave Desert largely. So they think, or one of the hypotheses, and they don't have any data really to support the hypothesis yet, because we don't know what birds see. We actually have a very poor understanding of what birds see, how they process images, how they see contrast, whether they so we see a lake, so we're calling it a lake effect. Maybe they don't see it that way. It might be something else that's confounding them, but something's attracting them there. And we need to understand that a little bit better. Because it might just be that they're under pathways, it might be there's other things on the site that are attracting them there, maybe little cooling ponds or something like that. But this is another critical issue. So just to show you a couple pictures, this is to give you a sense for the scale. This is the Desert Sunlight Project. I showed you this in the beginning with the bulldozed area. This is in 2009 when I visited the site. That's the property line. And that's it today. So 8 million solar panels in this project. So very, very large. That's Joshua Tree National Park back there. And you can see it actually affects they have to do some they have to do some terraforming of the landscape here because they have to actually make water flow through this without ripping the power plant down, which has happened and under construction for one of the projects, the Genesis project. This is the Topaz project, same size, also at 550 megawatt, about 3 miles by 4 miles on the side. This is on the Carrizo Plain, near the Carrizo Plain National Monument, which is one of the largest intact grasslands in California. That's what it looks like today. Also 8 million solar panels. Same manufacturer, same basically everything there. Groundwater consumption. This is something that I'm working on right now. We're putting together a publication. We've looked at all this water use data. It turns out for dust control, there's a lot of water being used. So when they bulldoze these lands, they suddenly become subject to the Clean Air Act because they have dust that's a nuisance. In fact, there was a car pileup near Antelope Valley about 8 years ago that they attribute to the construction of one of these solar power projects. And there was one other project that was actually getting their ARRA money, and they almost lost their ARRA money because there was a project that the city of Los Angeles shut them down because of the dust issue. So they had to come up with a way to deal with that. So, what is that? 500 million gallons a year of water on one of these projects. That's a lot of power too. And compared to other energy sources, this is much less water. But to an ecosystem, a little bit of water makes a big difference. You have pools, you have all sorts of ways. What are those fish called? Pupfish. Desert pupfish, those, when they get drained down, they have no water. There's barely any water for them. So that's something that people are going to be starting to monitor. It's going to change now that we have this new Groundwater Management Act in California. I think they're going to start cracking down on this a little bit more. And I haven't even talked about the cultural resources. And that's another issue, particularly on public lands where there's that long history. Native Americans actually have a special relationship with the BLM where they're supposed to get prior consultation before even projects are proposed. That did not happen in some of these cases. So you can see here, these are geoglyphs from a project called the Blythe Solar Project. About 10 years ago, road construction to the solar project damaged one of these geoglyphs. Don't know how old it is, but and then another
geoglyph.
Geoglyphs are these stick figures that we didn't know were in California until we started flying. So they're down near the Colorado River, near Blythe, California. You'll see signs for them. Intaglios is another word you'll hear for them. They're basically figures that are put into what we call desert pavement. They take rocks, and they take colored rocks, and they make them. And we didn't even know they were there because you can't really see them when you're walking around them, but when you get up in the air, that's when you start to notice them.
Do we have any guesses about how old they are?
They don't think they're that old. I think they're talking hundreds of years.
Which is still pretty old.
Still pretty old, absolutely, yeah.
The point is they're architectural sites.
Yeah.
They're saying archaeological one.
Yeah. I don't know if they would last that long, to be honest. I think their geology might outrace them. So this is the Genesis project. They actually did find a cremation site on part of this project, and they had to go around it, and you saw all sorts of quotes like this. And again, whether or not, irrespective of whether these are serious environmental impacts or impacts relative to conventional energy, it's almost not the point, right? If there's a perception that these projects are bad, that's going to slow the solar industry's growth, so that's an issue. So when you see quotes like this, they disrupted the peace of our ancestors and our relationship with the land, there's no mitigation for such a loss. That's a black eye on the solar industry in some ways when you see these things come up. So this is Alfredo Figueroa. He actually helped organize with Cesar Chavez farm workers back in the 1970s, and he's been a vocal person on Native American indigenous rights in solar projects. And here he's talking about fringe-toed lizards. And that's the other interesting thing here. We've learned through this process that a lot of these cultural resources are actually living organisms for these people. So in some way you think of artifacts as being stuff they made. Well, here they are thinking their cultural resources are these living organisms. These are fringe-toed lizards, an endangered species. They're getting, and they're referring to these lizards, they're getting squeezed out. We're the protectors. Ants, rats, turtles, nobody speaks for them. There's hawks, snakes, they live here, we live here. You got to remember, there was no Los Angeles, there was no Las Vegas. Where do you think we lived? Here's another. This is a Quechan tribal elder they seem to want to do it at the price of destroying history. It's an assault. They've already wiped out a lot of things, and now they want to wipe out the desert and any evidence of our past. Now, the interesting thing, and I think this goes to this question about deserts and our appreciation and value of them, and whether we do value them, because we saw a tremendous amount of activism around the Dakota Access Pipeline. Right? We saw Native Americans' rights being asserted in solidarity with environmental groups. There are no environmental groups to these protests. Like I went to a couple of them. There are maybe 20 folks from the tribes, a reporter, no environmental groups. And that, I think, is part of what we're calling this a green civil war, because the big NGOs have become so obsessed with climate. And maybe that's because the foundation's priorities are not clear, that they're starting to seem to lose some of these other issues. So they're prioritizing climate over biodiversity issues when we have crises in both. And again, I think that quote that talked about the false choice is really important and telling here. The last kind of environmental justice issue that's related to this is with worker health and safety. So we've had something called valley fever that occurs when you're exposed to soil, and there's a soil-borne pathogen that when there's a lot of dust, you breathe it, you get this valley fever, which is, I don't think it's fatal necessarily. I think there have been fatalities from it. It's just a very long, debilitating illness. In fact, when I started going to public meetings around 2009, 2010, I thought they were like the chemtrail people. People talking about valley fever. I never heard of it. I just heard everybody talking about it at these meetings. And then when I saw the Centers for Disease Control, 3 years later, document outbreaks of about 50 people contracting this at a solar farm, then I realized, oh, actually, this is a legit thing they're talking about. This is the Centers for Disease Control talking about this issue. So something else that we don't see in certain areas, but when you're in the desert, kicking up those spores can actually cause some problems. And then you have issues with cumulative impacts. This is that Ivanpah project, that solar power tower I showed you a couple times. I don't know if I showed you it operating, I showed you under construction, but that's remember I mentioned the tortoises got moved here, and then they got moved again. So like, there's no planning going on here. Like, people are just haphazardly proposing a project, it gets financed, it's close to transmission, let's build it. And in fact, we do need some planning. In fact, we did do some planning. So back in 2008, when they passed the Renewable Portfolio Standard requiring utilities to buy electricity from solar projects, they anticipated that it would cause biodiversity issues out there. So they started what's called the Western Solar Plan. Basically, they called it a programmatic environmental impact assessment across the American West to try to identify where are the where are the biggest issues, and where can we put. The BLM has this mandate, remember, to build on public lands. Where in that 250 million acres that they manage can you actually put this without causing major harm? And they did this for a couple of iterations. They got feedback from all the local BLM offices, ranchers, conservationists, off-road vehicle riders, everybody. Because that's the other thing with BLM is they're an agency with a mission. Right? You think about every Park Service has a mission. It's really clear. BLM's like protect wildlife, develop minerals, dig for oil and gas. Like, they're being pulled in let off-road vehicles go. They're being pulled in all these different directions because they don't quite have that clear mission. So at the end of the day, of the 250 million acres, they said 22 million would be good for solar. That was the initial 22 million that were open to development about 10 years ago. At the end of the day, they went through a planning process and identified about 300,000 acres worth of land that would be minimal impact if they were developed. Not no impact, but less impact. California has a sister process called the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan, which is basically focused on the Mojave and Colorado deserts. This is what one of those solar energy zones looks like. Anybody been to Blythe, California? Okay. Not many people go to Blythe. No. This is Desert Center. This is the Desert Sunlight Project. I've showed you a couple times, that really big one. Genesis, I've mentioned, that's the one that had the cremation site. Blythe, that's where the intaglios, the geoglyphs were damaged on those projects. But this area, it's along a highway corridor, it's close to transmission, has been targeted as California's solar energy zone, where they plan to develop. The way it works is that if you propose a project inside of these polygons that have been designated as lower conflict, you basically can go through the regulatory review process faster. If you propose a project outside of it, BLM can now kick you out, but before it even goes up for environmental review. So they have done some planning since to correct some of these issues with basically putting projects haphazardly all over the place. So that's been another good thing to see. Right now, the Trump administration is planning to get rid of this solar energy zone idea. That's partly because the Solar Industry Association, or Solar Energy Industry Association, has been lobbying for that because they don't want to be restricted. They see this as like losing their market cap, right? If they can only develop in these spots, that means they can't develop everywhere. That means they don't have unlimited market potential. So that's a little bit in the hopper right now. We're not sure what's going to happen with that. Most likely it will probably continue to go along, but never know. Whoops. So what can we learn? And I'm going to show you some win-win opportunities just to wrap up here. One, I think we have to start thinking more broadly about where we want to put all the solar. Right? We tend right now to say we need to put it in the cheapest place possible, where we generate the most kilowatt hours, but I think we're starting to see there are a lot more opportunities to be siting. Particularly in Northern California, we need to put more solar up here because we got a major bottleneck coming from Southern California up here. So we have to basically figure out where we're going to put this stuff. And that means also thinking about non-wires alternatives, thinking about more distributed solar, things like that. It's expensive, but things we have to think about. When the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan was put into effect, they had put together a scientific advisory panel to help inform that process as it moved along. And their initial recommendations were site with no regrets, meaning don't put projects in places you might regret putting it. So if you're going to basically complicate another crisis, you're not necessarily going to, in your effort to solve the climate crisis, not necessarily even going to help us solve the climate crisis in some ways. So that's very important. And going back to the social gap in renewable energy, remember I mentioned the NIMBY explanation, not very helpful. Certainly not helpful here because nobody lives out there. Right? The not in my backyard really not helpful because these are like public lands. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of acres with nobody living there. Or everybody's interested because it's public land, so we all have a stake in it. But participatory and collaborative regional planning with a science-based approach, thinking about species, cultural resources, and such is going to be really critical here. Now, just to kind of wrap that point up, this whole green civil war is what I would say a battle over values and priorities. Right? Some people say we have to put as much solar out there as fast as possible because the climate catastrophe is so fastly approaching. Right? And other people say, don't push us into that corner. We have other opportunities. We can configure this in a different way, possibly. So that's something that we're going to have to work through. And I think part of this is being very aware when you're forced into a false choice. It's conservation or it's solar panels. Right? It's biodiversity or it's climate change. How about both? Can we try to solve both at the same time? Is there any way we could do that? I think there is. I mentioned a lot of BLM public lands out in the Colorado and Mojave deserts. In the western Mojave Desert and in the Colorado Desert around Blythe in particular, there's a lot of retired agricultural fields. They're not BLM lands, so they're not part of that mandate, but they would actually be a very good resource to be utilizing. And there's going to be more and more of that retiring because the water rights are being sold to Los Angeles or being taken away from the Colorado River Compact and such. So you're going to see more and more agricultural areas become available for solar development. This is one near Lucerne Valley. It's an old alfalfa field. Agrivoltaics. This is a dual use of landscape. So it's basically putting solar panels up and above agriculture. We're starting to see some of this in France and Japan and such. You don't get the same agricultural output, and you probably don't get the same solar output, but you get a little of both, and that might help people, farmers and such like that, improve their situation. This is a picture from India. Every semester, my students, one student takes up a project, or one group of students take up a project to basically cover all of California's aqueducts and solar panels. And it's a decent amount of energy. Somewhere around, 5 or 6% of California's electricity supply could be provided by just covering our aqueducts. No land use impact, and you might even save some water, which in California means saving energy. Okay, our water is very energy intensive here, so there's a lot of win-win scenarios here, and we might start seeing some of this come online. This is my favorite new word, photovoltaics. These are basically floating solar fields. This one's, actually I'm not sure if this one, there's the largest one in the world just opened in China, and it's above an aquaculture operation. So underneath they have shellfish and stuff growing, and on top they have solar panels. Dual use of that. There's definitely issues, maybe there's bird issue there also, we're not sure, but thinking more, we could cover all our reservoirs, for example, in California with this. Cover our whole water system in solar panels. You'd save a lot of water from reduced evaporation. And this is pretty neat. This is California, obviously. This is a map put together by the EPA. And the EPA did their own screening of private land and said, oh, you know what? There's actually one, remember, the solar energy zones was about 300,000 acres. The EPA found 1.7 million acres in California that were either abandoned mines, landfills, RCRA sites, Resource Conservation Recovery Act sites, Superfund sites, basically lands that are of no other use right now, brownfields, old industrial sites. So that's a lot. That could actually more than power California right there, that 1.7 million acres. And they screened it for things like access to transmission and slope and all that stuff as well. And then this, going on that distributed side, if we're worried about global warming and its impact on cities, and one of those impacts are going to be elderly and compromised people who are going to get heat stroke, how about giving them some shaded parking? Right? How many people look for shade? Right? We're all looking for shade all the time. It's funny, when I would drive out to the Ivanpah site, I would drive through a parking lot, and there'd be all these signs saying, shaded parking this way. I never found that shaded parking. And they built these giant solar power plants, so I'm like, guys, you could have covered the whole darn lot with that.
You were looking for the oasis in the desert.
That's exactly right. So, and then talking about win-win scenarios. So right now we're working on a grant proposal. We're not funded or anything like that, but we have some support, I hope, to increase pollinator services or ecosystem services on solar projects. So the new era where new projects are being built is in the San Joaquin Valley, and that has impacts too. The Farm Bureau doesn't want to lose any agricultural land, so they get upset when we lose agricultural land. And some of the farmers aren't very happy to see an agricultural operation disappear and then suddenly an industrial facility appear next to it. But what if there were hedgerows restored, native plants attracting native bees, increasing honeybee production, which could also be another revenue stream for someone who has the development. And it could also, we import so many bees from Minnesota and North Dakota to get these almonds to grow. Everyone needs a pollination service from a bee. If we can start to increase the ecosystem services around these solar projects, maybe they would actually become more acceptable over time, reduce water use and such. So, I said a lot here, and I went a little bit all over the place. I tried to keep it together with kind of this focus on biodiversity versus climate change. I feel very positive about the direction now. When I started this, I know I gave you a bunch of horror stories about bad solar projects. I think that is a thing of the past now. I think the developers are smarter. The rules are actually really expensive. All those tortoise translocations and such, that's really expensive. That stuff gets really expensive. And now the price of solar is so low, they can't afford that. They can't afford the permits. They can't afford, not to move all these tortoises. They can do it in Nevada, because Nevada doesn't require anything really. And that's probably our next. That's probably where I'm feeling least good about for California, which is what's going to happen in Nevada and Arizona for our power, right? What are we going to do in those landscapes? So, how am I doing on time? Am I done?
You're good. When we can take some questions.
Okay, let's do it. Let's take questions.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for your patience.
So, for the bad quote-unquote projects, has anybody analyzed the, obviously, the environmental impact that you described versus the environmental impact if you did not have that solar power, if you had traditional energy? Has anybody done a loss gain analysis
No,
in the sense?
Not anything particular, but I mean, I think people would assume that the benefits of the solar, even with all the challenges I pointed out, are still going to be there.
Is that your opinion?
Yeah. I would say. I mean, I would not build these projects, and I would like to see the environmental organizations oppose. I think a lot of the projects that were really problematic really came in that era window, where a lot of projects got rushed. People didn't really know what they were doing yet. The regulatory institutions were not capable of thinking about the scale of the project. So I would still oppose a lot of those projects. I don't think they're good ideas. But that doesn't mean I don't think that they're providing a public benefit still.
Do you still think the net environmental impact is greater even with the bad projects than not?
The challenge is that word environmental, right? Because what do we mean by environmental? There's certainly trade-offs there. But yeah, I think that those solar projects have probably led to a lot of low-income, disadvantaged neighborhoods having natural gas power plants either not proposed or being shut down. And to me, that's my major concern in some ways, is like the public health impacts from energy systems. So I would say that the solar power is a net win. But if you're talking about desert tortoise and some of these species that are particularly the kit fox and some of these bird issues, that's just, it's a different set of environmental issues that you face. So I don't know if you can easily come up with a commensurate study to look at those trade-offs. That's a great question, though. Over here in that back.
No, it's not solar, but I was thinking, driving east here and looking at the thousands and thousands of wind turbine things.
Yeah.
Has anybody done any studies on the changing in microclimates?
Yes. Yeah, I've seen a couple ones now. There's one that showed that there is possibly a small heating effect if you powered all of civilization with onshore wind, which became a problem. People said, "Oh, but it's not. There's really not much more. California's really probably not even going to put much more onshore wind in the state. It's not very valuable these days. And you start seeing offshore wind." But what was the? Make sure I get the question. Did I respond to that correctly? Oh yeah, microclimates. Yeah.
Is anybody looking at the study for this?
Yeah.
I didn't remember. It's just 1%, so we don't have to worry about it. But then, what happens 50 years later? We find that 1% is terrible.
Yeah, there are a bunch of studies. I'd say we probably don't have a good picture of that yet. I've seen some that actually talk about the agricultural benefits from the microclimatic change, but then there's this paper that showed a little bit of a warming effect. But we need more studies. The answer there.
Get those academic people jobs, right?
I know.
You really emphasized the difference between the regulatory framework in different states.
Yeah.
Obviously, we don't have great environmental leadership at the national level. And you said you were worried about California versus Nevada and other places, and California import still, even though we've got regulations about what kind of projects we have, so they can be more of those win-wins, with more of a net benefit rather than marginal net benefit. But you said you were worried about importing solar from other states, so that we're still having a negative effect. We're just externalizing it to other states. So my question is, do you have any thoughts, or do you have any insights into regulatory changes in California, whether legislative changes or CPUC changes or administrative changes under the new administration, or that have already been done or planned by the last administration, or at the utility level, especially with a lot of regional and municipal utilities.
Yeah.
Palo Alto has its own utilities. Now we have Silicon Valley Clean Energy, Peninsula Clean Energy, these community choice aggregation utilities in our region where we could establish our own preferences. So basically, what's the latest that you know about the regulatory framework and changes to maybe tier or require more environmentally friendly utility solar production in what we import?
I think partly because of
Sorry
what,
for the rambling.
no, that's good. No, I totally got, I followed it. I think the challenge, partly, so we have those solar energy zones. There are solar energy zones in Nevada. They're not necessarily being followed because companies are basically going where the transmission is cheapest. If you're looking for what is the mechanism that's attracting projects to where they're going. Now, where you're seeing some changes is actually in that last point you made about the utilities. In the power purchase agreement, so when a solar power plant is built, they contract with the utility and they're given a 20-year guarantee to buy their electricity, or 10-year, whatever that year thing is nowadays. I've seen in Minnesota, and this is related to that pollination study, partly because they have a lot of beekeeping in Minnesota, and there's a lot of concern about that scraping that occurs, that they're putting it in a requirement in the power purchase agreement that they disclose the vegetation type that will be post-project, like what they're going to actually transform that landscape in. Now that, I don't think that that's the solution there, but that shows you the mechanism, which is, it's a contract. These are private contracts between two individuals. They can have anything in them. And if California wanted to basically make sure that what they buy from Nevada is not causing land use change or not imperiling species, then you can put that in the contract. So in the power purchase agreement, it would say no land use change associated with this, or no species impacted.
Well, have you heard anything about characteristics or outright requirements being even considered as a legislative measure? To say, even in Sacramento, saying any utility in California, when you're buying power, if you have these kinds of items in the contract, you get some kind of incentive or to require it. Do you know if there's any talk about that?
No, the only incentive is built into those solar energy zones, which is you don't know what you're going to get into if you go outside the zone, but you know you're going to get a very friendly regulatory process if you go in the zone. So that's still the only mechanism.
Sounds like a legislative opportunity.
It absolutely, it could definitely could be. But I mean, it was very promising to see that this vegetation disclosure, this is just the last year. So this might be, and I actually went to a marine clean, I gave a talk at PG&E with Marin, I keep saying the wrong name, Clean Energy, Marin Clean Energy. And they were basically saying all their source power is going to be no land use change, no biodiversity impact. So they're already planning to put it into their contracts. So I feel like that's probably the fastest and most efficient way to do it, is to basically pressure the CCAs, the community choice aggregators, the local utilities, maybe even the investor-owned utilities, to start embedding these requirements. I mean, I'm showing you a lot of projects that basically scraped a lot of carbon. I mean, plants have a lot of roots in the desert. I mean, most of the biomass in desert plants are below. So you're not even, you're basically causing more carbon debt that needs to be paid off with renewable energy generation when you clear these landscapes, right? So we want to make, so that could be the mechanism right there, is to say, from a legislative, if we want solar to be solving the climate crisis, can't be causing carbon emissions from land use change. That would be a very simple proxy for biodiversity in some ways. Because basically any ecosystem's got a lot of biodiversity, it's going to have a lot of carbon in it. So if you're going to, that would push things toward those more degraded lands perhaps. So that might be the particular framing for that legislation.
Last question, probably.
Okay, yeah.
So you mentioned that Northern California does not have a lot of industrial strength solar. I put rooftop solar on my house, and they would not let me put more rooftop solar on my house than so that I would be a net generator.
Yeah.
It had to flatten out. There wouldn't be a lot of environmental impact if I put more on my roof. What's with that?
That's the utility. That's the utility being very worried about their business model and where they're going to get their future. I mean, electric utilities have had flat. And that's why you're starting to see advertisements from electric utilities for electric vehicles, because they've had flat demand for over a decade now. In fact, in some cases, declining demand. And when people start putting more solar panels, they're just like, oh wait, that's less power for us to be, taking over. So I think we're going to see. You're definitely going to see some pushback when you want to put more distributed non-wire solutions. I mean, that's what they're calling non-wire solutions, is how we get, and I think the wildfire thing is just going to complicate all of this, right? Because now people are going to say, hey, maybe we should have less power lines out in these rural areas, and we should have more people being off the grid. And people say, oh, batteries and solar are so expensive. You know what's expensive? California real estate. A California home is expensive. And guess what? Those batteries and the solar panels on the roof is barely, it's like, solar panels are the high-end marble granite countertops, right? It's like, that's the trade-off. It's not desert biodiversity versus solar panels.
So it's actually, I mean, with the cost having fallen where it is, it's actually the California labor that's the marble countertop.
Yeah.
I mean, this stuff is really cheap when you install it in India because your labor is not California labor costs.
I could see that too, yeah. Well, thank you all for your attention. It's really great to meet you all.